Have you ever wondered why you survived what should have destroyed you? Have you questioned why you made it through trials that broke other people, circumstances that left others permanently scarred, and storms that shipwrecked those who seemed stronger and more prepared than you were? Have you found yourself asking why God carried you through the valley of the shadow of death when others didn't make it out? Why you emerged from the furnace of affliction when others were consumed by the flames? Why you walked on water when others sank beneath the waves of their circumstances? Have you sometimes felt guilty for surviving when others didn't, or confused about why your story includes chapters of miraculous deliverance while others' stories seem to end in tragedy and loss? What if I told you that your survival wasn't random luck, divine favoritism, or coincidental timing, but evidence that God preserved you through the storm because He needs you to become a lighthouse for others who are still lost at sea, a guide for those who are just entering the wilderness you've already crossed, and a living testimony that the storms of life don't have to be the end of the story but can become the beginning of your greatest ministry? Can you feel that weight of divine purpose settling on your heart right now? That growing awareness that your survival wasn't just about your personal deliverance, but about your preparation for assignment. That recognition that every tear you cried, every prayer you whispered in desperation, every moment when you thought you couldn't take another step, was actually God developing in you the compassion, wisdom, and spiritual authority you would need to lead others through similar valleys. You weren't just saved from your storm, chosen one, you were saved through it. And that distinction makes all the difference in understanding your calling and embracing your destiny as a wounded healer who can speak life into dead situations because you've experienced resurrection power in your own life. Before we explore this life-transforming truth about why you survived and what you're now called to do with your survival, I need you to comment 777 below as a declaration that you're ready to stop seeing your past pain as something to hide and start recognizing it as the very qualification that equips you to minister to others. This isn't just a number, it's a commitment to transform your mess into your message and your test into your testimony. And to those beautiful souls who have supported this ministry through super thanks, your generosity demonstrates that you understand how God uses the resources of those who have been delivered to bless those who are still in bondage. And your faithfulness is multiplying the very ministry that flows from transformed lives. Throughout Scripture, we see a consistent pattern that reveals one of God's most profound methods of developing ministry and leadership. He allows His chosen ones to experience deep valleys so they can become effective guides for others who must walk through similar terrain. This isn't divine cruelty or cosmic coincidence, it's strategic preparation that develops the kind of authentic authority that can only come from personal experience with God's delivering power. You cannot lead others where you have never been, you cannot guide people through storms you have never survived, and you cannot offer hope to the hopeless unless you have experienced hope being born in the darkness of your own despair. Consider Joseph, who survived betrayal by his brothers, false accusation by Potiphar's wife, and abandonment in Pharaoh's prison, not because he was lucky or specially favored, but because God was preparing him to lead Egypt and surrounding nations through 7 years of devastating famine. Every injustice Joseph endured, every moment of suffering he experienced, every season when he felt forgotten and alone, was developing in him the character, wisdom, and faith he would need to preserve the lives of millions during a crisis that would have destroyed them without his leadership. When Joseph finally revealed himself to his brothers, he didn't speak as someone who had merely survived difficulty, but as someone who understood the divine purpose behind his suffering. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph recognized that his survival wasn't just about his personal victory, but about his preparation to become a deliverer for others who would face life-threatening circumstances. The same pattern appears in the life of Moses, who survived 40 years in Pharaoh's house, learning leadership and administration. 40 years in the wilderness learning humility and dependence on God, and countless encounters with divine power before being commissioned to lead Israel out of Egyptian bondage. Every experience of Moses' life, including his failures and setbacks, was preparing him for the moment when God would use him to deliver an entire nation from slavery. David's survival through years of running from King Saul, hiding in caves, and living as a fugitive wasn't just about preserving his life until he could become king. It was about developing in him the heart of a shepherd king who could lead with both strength and compassion, who understood what it meant to depend completely on God's protection, and who could write psalms that would comfort and encourage millions of people throughout history who would face their own seasons of persecution and hiding. Even Jesus himself experienced temptation, rejection, betrayal, suffering, and death, not just to accomplish our salvation, but to become a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses because he was tempted in every way, yet without sin. Hebrews 2:18 explains, "Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." His survival through every form of human suffering qualified him to become the ultimate guide for everyone who would ever face trials and temptations. This biblical pattern reveals a profound truth about God's methodology. He doesn't just rescue people from their storms. He develops them through their storms so they can become rescue workers for others. Your survival wasn't the end goal, it was the preparation for your assignment. You weren't delivered just so you could live comfortably, but so you could live purposefully as someone who carries the light of hope into the darkness where others are still trapped. But this calling to lead others out of storms requires you to understand several crucial principles about how God transforms survivors into leaders. First, you must recognize that your experience, no matter how painful it was, has given you credibility and authority that cannot be obtained through education, training, or natural gifting alone. When you speak to someone who is going through what you have already survived, your words carry weight because they come from proven experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The person struggling with addiction doesn't need to hear from someone who has read about recovery. They need to hear from someone who has walked the painful path of sobriety and can testify that freedom is possible. The individual facing financial ruin doesn't need advice from someone who has always been comfortable. They need guidance from someone who has experienced God's provision in the midst of lack and can speak with authority about his faithfulness as a provider. The family dealing with betrayal and broken relationships needs wisdom from someone who has experienced restoration after devastating loss, not counseling from someone who has never had their trust shattered. Your survival has given you a language of hope that can only be spoken by those who have learned to find God in the darkness. You understand the difference between religious platitudes and life-giving truth because you have tested God's promises in the fire of real-life crisis and found them to be absolutely reliable. This tested faith becomes a beacon of hope for others who are wondering if God really cares, if He really hears, and if He really has the power to change their circumstances. Second, you must understand that your responsibility as a survivor extends beyond your personal comfort and includes a mandate to seek and save those who are lost in the same wilderness you escaped. Luke 22:32 records Jesus telling Peter, "But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Jesus wasn't praying that Peter would avoid failure completely, but that his faith would survive failure and that his restoration would position him to strengthen others who would face similar challenges. This principle reveals that God often allows His chosen ones to experience failure, weakness, and recovery specifically so they can help others navigate the same journey. Your breakdown wasn't random, your failure wasn't meaningless, and your rescue wasn't purely for your benefit. God allowed you to go through what would have destroyed a person who wasn't destined to become a deliverer, and He brought you through it. because he knew others would need someone who understood their struggle from the inside out. Third, you must recognize that leading others out of storms requires more than just telling your story. It requires developing the spiritual authority and practical wisdom necessary to guide people through complex and dangerous terrain. It's one thing to survive a storm, it's another thing to become skilled at helping others navigate through storms. This development process often involves additional training, testing, and refinement that prepares you not just to be a survivor, but to be an effective leader of other survivors. This is why many people find that their calling becomes clearer after their survival rather than during their crisis. The initial storm develops your character and proves God's faithfulness in your life, but the subsequent seasons develop your ministry skills and spiritual authority. You learn how to pray with faith because you've seen God answer desperate prayers. You develop discernment because you've learned to recognize His voice in the noise of crisis. You gain wisdom because you've seen the consequences of both good and bad decisions during critical moments. The transformation from survivor to leader also requires you to shift your focus from your own pain to other people's potential. This doesn't mean ignoring or minimizing what you've been through, but it means allowing your experience to create compassion rather than bitterness, wisdom rather than cynicism, and hope rather than fear. The enemy wants your survival to make you self-protective and inward-focused, but God wants your survival to make you other-focused and purpose-driven. Many survivors struggle with this transition because they become so accustomed to survival mode that they find it difficult to shift into leadership mode. Survival mode is about self-preservation, protecting what little you have, and avoiding additional pain. Leadership mode is about taking risks to help others, investing your resources in other people's breakthrough, and being willing to be vulnerable about your own struggles in order to give hope to those who are still struggling. This shift requires a conscious decision to stop allowing your past pain to control your future purpose. It means choosing to see your survival as qualification rather than disqualification, as preparation rather than limitation, as evidence of God's call on your life rather than proof that you're too damaged to be used effectively. The very things that the enemy used to try to destroy you become the tools that God uses to equip you for ministry. Your survival story becomes a powerful weapon against the enemy's lies that tell people their situation is hopeless, their mistakes are unforgivable, their pain is too deep to heal, or their circumstances are too difficult for God to change. When you testify about God's faithfulness in your life, you're not just sharing information, you're demonstrating possibility. You're proving that God is still in the miracle business, that His love is stronger than our failures, and that His power is greater than our problems. But becoming an effective leader of others through storms requires you to maintain your own spiritual health and continue growing in your relationship with God. The temptation for many survivors is to become so focused on helping others that they neglect their own spiritual development, or to believe that their past experience is sufficient for all future ministry challenges. The truth is that each person you're called to help will present unique challenges that require fresh wisdom, renewed strength, and continued dependence on God's guidance. This is why many effective ministers and counselors maintain regular spiritual disciplines, continue learning and growing, and surround themselves with other mature believers who can provide support, accountability, and wisdom. Leading others through storms is spiritually demanding work that requires supernatural strength, divine wisdom, and emotional resilience that can only be maintained through ongoing relationship with God. The calling to lead others out of storms also involves understanding the difference between rescuing people and empowering them to find their own way to freedom. While your natural compassion might make you want to carry people through their difficulties, true leadership involves teaching them how to walk, how to trust God for themselves, and how to develop their own relationship with Him that will sustain them through future challenges. This means learning how to share your testimony in ways that point people to God rather than to you, how to offer hope without creating dependence, and how to provide guidance without taking responsibility for other people's choices. Effective leaders understand that their role is to show people the path to freedom, not to carry them down that path. Your survival has also given you the ability to recognize authentic versus counterfeit hope. Because you've experienced real deliverance, you can distinguish between temporary fixes and permanent solutions, between human effort and divine intervention, between positive thinking and genuine faith. This discernment becomes crucial when helping others navigate through the many voices and options that promise relief but don't provide lasting transformation. People who are in crisis are often vulnerable to false hope, quick fixes, and solutions that promise immediate relief without addressing underlying issues. Your experience has taught you that real healing and deliverance usually involve a process that includes facing truth, taking responsibility, making difficult changes, and learning to trust God even when circumstances don't immediately improve. This hard-won wisdom protects both you and those you're called to help from wasting time and energy on approaches that don't produce lasting results. The multiplication principle is another crucial aspect of leading others out of storms. God doesn't just want you to help one person or even a few people. He wants your ministry to multiply as those you help become equipped to help others. This is how movements begin and how the impact of your survival extends far beyond what you could accomplish through individual ministry alone. This multiplication happens when you don't just rescue people, but train them to become rescuers. When you don't just provide hope, but develop hope givers. When you don't just share your testimony, but equip others to develop and share their own testimonies. The goal is not to create dependence on your ministry, but to create a network of healed healers who can reach places and people that you could never reach alone. Throughout church history, the most effective ministries have been started by people who survived significant trials and felt called to help others navigate similar challenges. Organizations that serve addiction recovery, domestic violence survivors, grieving families, financial crisis situations, and countless other specialized needs often trace their origins to individuals who experienced God's deliverance and felt compelled to extend that same hope to others. But the calling to lead others out of storms isn't limited to formal ministry or non-profit organizations. It can be expressed through mentoring relationships, friendship evangelism, workplace witness, community involvement, or simply being available when God brings hurting people across your path. The key is maintaining an awareness that your survival has given you both the ability and the responsibility to be a source of hope for others who are facing what you have already overcome. This awareness changes how you view your daily interactions and relationships. Instead of seeing yourself as just another person trying to get through life, you begin to recognize yourself as someone who carries divine hope and healing power. You become more sensitive to the pain that others are hiding, more willing to share your story when it might help someone, and more intentional about creating environments where broken people can find hope and healing. Your survival has also equipped you with a unique understanding of God's character that can only be developed through personal experience with His faithfulness during impossible circumstances. You know that He hears desperate prayers because you've prayed them and seen Him respond. You know that He provides for His children because you've experienced His provision when resources were exhausted. You know that He brings beauty from ashes because you've seen Him transform your own tragedy into triumph. This experiential knowledge of God's character becomes a foundation for faith that cannot be shaken by intellectual arguments or circumstantial evidence. When you're helping someone who is questioning God's goodness, love, or power, you can speak from personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Your faith has been tested and proven genuine, and that authenticity gives weight to your words and credibility to your ministry. As we approach the conclusion of this life-changing message, I want you to understand that recognizing your calling to lead others out of storms doesn't mean you have to quit your job, start a ministry, or completely change your lifestyle. It means understanding that wherever you are and whatever you're doing, you carry the light of hope that can illuminate the darkness for others who are struggling with what you have already overcome. Your workplace might be where God wants to use your survival story to reach a colleague who is facing similar challenges. Your neighborhood might be where He wants to position you to help a family that is going through what you went through. Your church might be where He wants to develop a ministry that serves people with needs that you understand because you've experienced them yourself. The key is being available, being sensitive to divine opportunities, and being willing to be vulnerable about your own journey when it can help someone else find their way to freedom. This doesn't mean oversharing or making yourself the center of attention, but it means being honest about God's faithfulness in your life when that honesty can give hope to someone who needs it. To those precious souls who have supported this ministry through Super Thanks, your generosity demonstrates that you understand how God uses the resources of survivors to fund the rescue of others who are still trapped. Your faithfulness in giving is multiplying the impact of survival stories and creating opportunities for more people to experience the hope and healing that you have received. If this message has opened your eyes to see your survival as preparation for ministry rather than just personal victory, if you're beginning to understand that God preserved you through your storm because He needs you to help others through theirs, if you're ready to transform your pain into purpose and your mess into your message, then take a moment to respond. Comment 777 below as a declaration that you accept the calling to lead others out of the storms you have survived. Like this video to help other survivors recognize their calling to become rescuers. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss teachings that will equip you for the ministry that flows from your survival. Share this message with others who need to understand that their survival has greater purpose. Most importantly, begin looking for opportunities to use your story, your wisdom, and your faith to help others who are walking through valleys that you have already crossed. Start conversations, offer encouragement, provide practical help, and be willing to be used by God as a lighthouse for those who are still lost at sea. Your survival wasn't the end of your story, it was the beginning of your ministry. You weren't just rescued from your storm, you were prepared through your storm to become a rescuer of others. The pain you endured has qualified you for purpose you never imagined. And the God who brought you through is ready to use you to bring others through as well. You survived the storm because you were meant to lead others out. Now it's time to step into that calling, embrace that destiny, and allow God to use your survival story to write chapters of hope in the lives of those who are still fighting for their lives in the storms you have already conquered. Your test has become your testimony, your mess has become your message, and your survival has become your calling to save others. Lead on, chosen one. There are people waiting in the storm who need someone like you to show them the way out. Your survival was their salvation in the making, and now it's time to complete what God began when He carried you through the valley of the shadow of death into the ministry of life and hope.